Hi and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Liz and this is a Catholic Mother's Journey. I'm really pleased you're joining me today. So today I'm going to do a testimony update. I have got George with me today. If you don't know my channel, you're not familiar with my other videos, George is my son, he's 11 years old. And I did a testimony all about my story and my journey to my faith becoming alive about 2 years ago, over 2 years ago now. So I thought I'd do an update and I've got George with me this time. It's really good to have you, George. And George really to me is my secret weapon. It's really through what happened to George that the Lord led me back to my faith and made it come alive. George to me is an example of true selfless Christianity. Sorry to embarrass you, George, but it's true. Bearing suffering without complaint, doing it for others and uniting it to Jesus. I'll attach my first testimony video to this video if you've not already seen it. So last time I talked about how when George became ill and became disabled when he was very young, I had a big conversion in my faith that really resulted in all of this happening to me. Things were really transformed. The circumstances in our family were really turned upside down. But spiritually, I started to become very different. You know, things were transformed for me on the inside. Obviously, it was a very difficult time. It's been a very difficult time, of course, for George, but for all of us, you know, the whole family. I think as his parents, you know, the emotional burden is great when that happens to your child, and physically, you know, just managing everything's been very difficult. As I mentioned on my original testimony, it was this idea of surrendering the burden to the Lord that really transformed things to me. Literally just handing that burden over to him, and that really changed, it really transformed the situation. And it's this idea in Matthew 11 where Jesus speaks. It's verses 28 to 29. I'll just read that quickly. Come to me, all you who are weary and overburdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden light. And that's been true the whole time for me, you know, through all these difficult circumstances. I'm not saying I've got it perfect and that I surrendered perfectly. I really haven't at times. I've really messed it up. You know, you can hand something over to the Lord and then things happen, things get bad, and you can take it back again without even really realising it. But that's sort of what we naturally try and do as human beings. We try to take control again and try to sort things out for ourselves. So I've often messed it up, and then I have to remember to re-surrender it to the Lord. But when we hand things over to him, that's when we can experience peace and joy in him, even in difficult circumstances. And I've experienced that throughout our journey, throughout all the difficulties that poor George has faced, and we are his family have faced as well. It's just remembering to re-surrender that burden over to the Lord when we start trying to take it back. So it's a process of learning to lay down your burden and hand it over to the Lord, and to keep on doing it when we try and take things back again. So today I really just felt like I should talk about what happens when we lay down our burdens and we give them to the Lord. You know, when we take on his yoke. What actually happens? I think it depends what is going on in your life. It depends where you are in your faith journey. It depends what season you're in. You know, different things can happen when we lay our burdens down to the Lord, but he does transform things. I mean, it may not end up looking how we want it to look like, but things do change when we lay down our burdens and give them to him. And this can apply whatever path you're on in your life. You know, it's not just about us. But I'm sharing this to hopefully encourage you wherever you are in your journey, if you're watching this, and encourage you to lay down your burden too. You know, it's probably looks different to what we've got, the cross that we have in our family, but you know, the principle applies to all of us, whatever we're going through. So as I've said before, when I first knew that I was to lay down this burden to the Lord, surrender it to him, hand it to him, And I prayed and I prayed for this to happen. You know, it didn't happen straight away. It was like a process of prayer and handing it over. And then I really felt a sort of supernatural lift. It was like a burden was lifted. And I started to feel peace when that happened. You know, I went from a very bad situation to suddenly feeling the peace of the Lord and joy as well. And that sort of happened not consistently, absolutely not. I've had moments of peace and joy during this journey. And back then, when I first started doing that and praying in that way, you know, it definitely wasn't a constant feeling of joy and of peace, not at all, because the circumstances were so awful, really, you know, very difficult. We didn't really have any help at home for years to support us. You know, George's medical issues just were getting worse and worse, and things were just very difficult. You know, as I've said, the emotional burden of it all as a parent was very tricky. So, you know, these visits to hospital as well, constant visits to hospital and sort of emergencies, you know, dashing to the hospital in the middle of the night, not knowing what was going to happen to George, all that stress and anxiety. It was just so busy as well. I found it really hard for many years to even find the time to pray and speak to God about what was going on, and even have the time to pray about handing it over to him. It felt like I had no free time, no quiet time to just sit and do that. It was just so full on. It was like I was firefighting for years in this really, really difficult situation. But those moments of peace and joy, when I did have some time to pray to the Lord, you know, I did experience that peace and that joy at times. So I had peaceful moments. And I think if I didn't have that faith in the Lord and that knowing to hand that over to him, hand over all my burdens to him, I don't quite know how I would have kept going through it all. So how really did I get through this time? You know, it was a very tricky time and it went on for years. You know, we were caring for George, we were trying to deal with all of his hospital admissions, we were trying to be there for our other children. You know, very challenging, very tricky, pulled in all directions, you know, upsetting situations, stress, anxiety. Well, I really feel like the Lord, during that whole time, he sustained us. He was there. You know, that's the promise, isn't it, in the Bible? When everything goes wrong in life, the Lord is always there with us. You know, he doesn't promise that things will be easy, but he does promise that he will always be with us. He will never leave us or forsake us. And he was with us. You know, maybe it didn't feel like it at times, but he was sustaining us. It was like we were in the desert and he was sending us manna. He was providing for us during that really hard time. It was still really hard, but he did sustain us. You know, it was like a wilderness period. It's been like a long wilderness period, a bit like when the Israelites, they left Egypt, didn't they? But they went wandering for 40 years in the wilderness. And that generation who were freed from Egypt, they didn't even end up going into the promised land, did they? Because they were wandering in the wilderness for so long. That promise, the entry into the promised land was delayed, wasn't it? For various reasons. So they were wandering for years and years, but the Lord sustained them, didn't he? He sent them manna in the desert, even though they complained about it. He kept them going, and I really feel like he did that for us as well. The Israelites went wandering through the wilderness after they'd been freed from Egypt, and for me it was like my Egypt was my old life. I left that behind a few years ago. As I've said on my channel before, you know, I quit my job in the legal world. I used to work in a corporate law firm, left that all behind, and life has really changed. So I left my old life behind. I left my Egypt behind. Eventually, after some hesitation, some toing and froing, and then came a wilderness, definitely a wilderness period. So using that analogy of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, I found myself in the wilderness for many years, having left that old life behind. It was very tricky. As I say, we had very little support. We didn't have proper care support for a really long time. But God sent us support. He provided for us. You know, we had support from friends, family, even if it was like WhatsApp messages of support and encouragement. We had some support, and I believe that the Lord worked through people during that time to support us. And God does that. When you choose to do what he's calling you to do. I felt he called me out of my old job, out of my old life. He will sustain you. It's not like things will be perfect overnight. Absolutely not. It's all a process and a journey, and things might seem harder to begin with. That's what it felt like to me. It was like out of my old life straight into the wilderness. And at times, I have to be honest, the old life looked very appealing compared to what I was then going through. I was like, Lord, I really felt like you called me to this, but this is just terrible. This is awful. This is so hard. I'm up in the night worrying about George. I'm not getting any rest, any sleep. It's very difficult. Really, am I even on the right path? I don't even know. And looking back now, I'm like, well, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe we got through that time. How on earth did we do it? And I really believe it was only by God's grace that we got through that period, through the manner that he sent us. So during this wilderness season, if we call it that, I definitely experienced some periods of desolation. Now, desolation, according to St. Ignatius of Loyola, is where you experience a state of spiritual dryness. It's like spiritual darkness and you don't feel God's presence. So I did definitely have moments like that, but not all the time. It was like the circumstances were bad. And then I also experienced at times a sense of desolation, but I also received consolation. So that's when you feel a close presence of the Lord. So it's the opposite of desolation. So I had moments of both. And I have to say the consolation that I received during that time was really very strong. Things were going really wrong. I was up in the night worrying about George, whatever it was that was happening, in hospital, being rushed into hospital in the middle of the night. But I actually almost felt the Lord's presence more strongly in those moments, despite what was going on, in the physical circumstances. The Lord's presence was really strong. I really felt him sustaining us very strongly during that time. And the Eucharist, when I was able to go to Mass, I felt the Eucharist really sustained me during that time as well, and God's presence in that. So that very strong awareness of the Lord's presence in the most horrendous circumstances, that really kept me going. That is what kept me going. And so those feelings of, oh, I want my old life back, there were fleeting moments really in the grand scheme of things, because the Lord's presence was so strong and that kept me going. So why does God allow a wilderness season? Well, he allows them for a specific purpose. It's for a stripping process, a purification process where he works on our hearts and he changes us. He does a transformation on us inside and out. He really does transform us. My faith was transformed. I've changed so much during that process. It was so tough, but I've really changed. It's also a testing season where we learn to trust God and trust in his provision for us. Also, we can make mistakes during this wilderness process. We can make mistakes and go the wrong way. And this is precisely what happened to the Israelites. They made mistakes, didn't they? They were grumbling, they were complaining about the manna. They ended up worshipping a golden calf. They made many mistakes, and that prolonged their wilderness period. And that can happen to us. I know that I made mistakes. All of this was a learning process, and I was learning to discern the voice of God. And as I was learning to hear his voice, I was making mistakes and I was going the wrong way. I know I prolonged it here and there by going the wrong way at times, but that's all part of the process of learning and the Lord refining us and building us up. But the Lord can even use our mistakes for good, can't he? It's not a waste. None of it's a waste. He can use all of it for good. So don't feel that all that time is wasted, because as long as we're trying to follow the Lord and do what he's calling us to, none of it is wasted. Being totally honest, I think for me, one of the things that really slowed me down was my failure to accept that the Lord was allowing this to happen to George, that he allowed George to become ill as a baby and become brain damaged and become severely disabled. I really couldn't accept this for a long time, that the Lord had allowed it to happen. And because I struggled with accepting that, I really think it slowed me down. So, we make these mistakes, don't we? We make these mistakes, I'm just being honest there, but that definitely slowed me down. And when I really came to the point of accepting this, that God had a purpose in all of this, I really felt that my journey quickened. The path was easier to walk along. I think that wilderness journey really sped up after I had that breakthrough in being able to accept that the Lord had allowed this to happen to George. So I think I was probably truly in the wilderness for at least 5 years. You know, I left that Egypt behind, that old life behind, truly about 5 years ago. You know, prior to that, I probably still had one foot left in my old life, in my Egypt, for, you know, a few years before that as well. So we're talking like a long period of time here. Now, the last sort of 5 years or so have been a very busy period, but they've also been quite isolated, being at home a lot. We had another baby about 4.5 years ago. So that's been very busy, you know, being at home, caring for a baby, caring for George, of course. It's been very busy. And then the hardest season of all was probably last year, 2024, when George ended up in hospital a lot, in intensive care. He was ill a lot, and it was very tricky, you know, rushing him to the hospital in the middle of the night, very stressful, very emotional. You know, the anxiety was, as you can imagine, as his parents, was very great. So that was the hardest season yet. And yet, in the midst of all that, the Lord said to me, I want you to go on YouTube. He said, I want you to go on YouTube. And I was sort of trying to manage things, trying to firefight things at home in very tricky circumstances. And then I heard I was to go on YouTube, and I was like, what? Really, Lord, now? Do you not know what's going on in my life at the moment? How on earth am I going to do that? But the Lord surprises us sometimes, doesn't he? So how did I get through all those times? Well, it was by God's grace. It really was by God's grace, because as I said earlier, I look back now and I'm like, how did I get through that period of time in my life? How did I survive? How did we survive as a family? I literally don't know how we did it. The Lord sent us that manna. He sent us that grace to get through it. But it was also about trying to keep our eyes on him, following him, trying to do what he was calling me to do, you know, learning to hear his voice. Things got so much easier when I was able to discern his voice better. I'm not saying I can do it perfectly now, but I can hear far more clearly now. And that came from, you know, spending time with him and, you know, dealing with things in the secret place, in prayer time. Also, you know, spending time with others in the faith, going to conferences, for example. What really helped me was going to conferences in the Catholic Charismatic Renewal, where I could have prophetic ministry, you know, and other people could speak into my life, because I was at a point, you know, going back a few years, where I could not hear the Lord's voice for myself. So I needed that encouragement from others. And also people praying for us. That made a huge difference. You know, having Christian friends who could encourage me and pray for us, that just made such a huge difference. You know, it helped me keep going. And of course, the sacraments, you know, going to Mass really helped me. And I said this on my original testimony as well. It really was going to Mass. That's what originally, it was the first thing that really helped me when the circumstances in our lives started getting really difficult. So anyway, it was like that for many years in our lives, and it's been very difficult. But as I said, the Lord has always been there, and he has been sustaining us through it all. But these are seasons. We're talking about seasons. I mean, to me, it was a long wilderness season, and it seemed to go on forever. And I would say to the Lord in my prayer time, Lord, when is this going to end? It feels like it's going on forever. Is the season ever going to change? But the season finally did change. You know, I'm not saying life is perfect at all, but finally the season does change. So I hope that encourages you. If you're going through a wilderness season, you know, keep going. The season does change, and I'm going to talk about that more on the next video. But in the meantime, I really hope that has blessed and encouraged you so far. Please do take a moment to like and share the video with anyone who comes to mind when you're watching, who you think might like to see it. I pray that you have a really blessed day, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. So until then, God bless. And that's bye from me and bye from George. Bye.